Section 3 of Irish Wit and Humour. The author is anonymous. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by JCarson. John Philpot Curren. Part 1. His birth. John Philpot Curren was born at Newmarket, a small village in the county of Cork, on the 24th of July, 1750. His father, James Curren, was seneschal of the manor, and possessed of a very moderate income. His mother was a very extraordinary woman. Eloquent and witty, she was the delight of her neighbors, and their chronicle and arbitress. Her stories were of the olden time, and made their way to the hearts of the people, who delighted in her wit and the truly national humor of her character. Little Curren used to hang with ecstasy upon his mother's accents, used to repeat her tales and her jests, and caught up her enthusiasm. After her death he erected a monument over her remains, upon which the following memorial was inscribed: "Here lieth all that was mortal of Martha Curren, a woman of many virtues, few foibles, great talents, and no vice." This tablet was inscribed in her memory by a son who loved her, and whom she loved. Curren as Punch's man. Curren's first effort in public commenced when a boy in the droll character of Mr. Punch's man. It occurred in this way. One of the puppet shows, known as Punch and Judy, arrived at Newmarket, to the great gratification of the neighborhood. Young Curren was an attentive listener at every exhibition of the show. At length Mr. Punch's man fell ill, and immediately ruin threatened the establishment. Curren, who had devoured all the man's eloquence, offered himself to the manager as Mr. Punch's man. His services were gladly accepted, and his success so complete that crowds attended every performance, and Mr. Punch's new man became the theme of universal panegyric. Curren at a debating society. Curren's account of his introduction and debut at a debating society is the identical first appearance of hundreds. "Upon the first of our assembling," he says, "I attended, my foolish heart throbbing with the anticipated honor of being styled the learned member that opened the debate, or the very eloquent gentleman who has just sat down. All day the coming scene had been flitting before my fancy and cajoling it. My ear already caught the glorious melody of 'Hear him! Hear him!' Already I was practising how to steal a sidelong glance at the tears of generous approbation bubbling in the eyes of my little auditory, never suspecting, alas, that a modern eye may have so little affinity with moisture that the finest gunpowder may be dried upon it. I stood up. My mind was stored with about a folio volume of matter, but I wanted a preface, and for want of a preface the volume was never published. I stood up, trembling through every fibre, but remembering that in this I was but imitating Tully, I took courage, and had actually proceeded almost as far as Mr. Chairman, when, to my astonishment and terror, I perceived that every eye was riveted upon me. There were only 6 or 7 present, and the little room could not have contained as many more. Yet was it to my panic-stricken imagination as if I were the central object in nature, and assembled millions were gazing upon me in breathless expectation. I became dismayed and dumb. My friends cried, 'Hear him!' but there was nothing to hear. My lips, indeed, went through the pantomime of articulation, but I was like the unfortunate fiddler at the fair, who, coming to strike up the solo that was to ravish every ear, discovered that an enemy had maliciously soaped his bow; or rather, like poor Punch, as I once saw him, grimacing a soliloquy, of which his prompter had most indiscreetly neglected to administer the words. Such was the début of stuttering Jack Curren, or orator mum, as he was waggishly styled. But not many months elapsed ere the sun of his eloquence burst forth in dazzling splendor. Curren and the banker. A Limerick banker, remarkable for his sagacity, had an iron leg. "His leg," said Curren, "is the softest part about him." His duel with St. Leger. Curren was employed at Cork to prosecute a British officer of the name of St. Leger for an assault upon a Catholic clergyman. St. Leger was suspected by Curren to be a creature of Lord Doneraile, and to have acted upon the influence of his lordship's religious prejudice. Curren rated him soundly on this, and with such effect that St. Leger sent him a challenge the next day. They met, but as Curren did not return his fire, the affair ended. "It was not necessary," said Curren, "for me to fire at him, for he died in 3 weeks after the duel, of the report of his own pistol." The Monks of the Screw. This was the name of a club that met on every Saturday during term in a house in Kevin Street, and had for its members Curren, Grattan, Flood, Father O'Leary, Lord Charlemont, Judge Day, Judge Metchke, Judge Chamberlain, Lord Avonmore, Bowes Daly, George Ogle, and Mr. Keller. Curren, being Grand Prior of the order, composed the charter song as follows: "When St. Patrick our order created, and called us the monks of the screw, good rules he revealed to our abbot, to guide us in what we should do. But first he replenished his fountain with liquor the best in the sky, and he swore by the word of his saintship that fountain should never run dry. My children, be chaste till you're tempted, while sober be wise and discreet, and humble your bodies with fasting, whene'er you've got nothing to eat. Then be not a glass in the convent, except on a festival found, and this rule to enforce I ordain it, a festival all the year round." Lord Avonmore. Curren was often annoyed when pleading before Lord Avonmore, owing to his lordship's habit of being influenced by first impressions. He and Curren were to dine together at the house of a friend, and the opportunity was seized by Curren to cure his lordship's habit of anticipating. "Why, Mr. Curren, you have kept us a full hour waiting dinner for you," grumbled our Lord Avonmore. "Oh, my dear lord, I regret it much. You must know it seldom happens, but I've just been witness to a most melancholy occurrence. My God, you seem terribly moved by it. Take a glass of wine. What was it? What was it?" "I will tell you, my lord, the moment I can collect myself. I had been detained at court, in the Court of Chancery. Your lordship knows the Chancellor sits late." I do, but go on." "Well, my lord, I was hurrying here as fast as ever I could. I did not even change my dress. I hope I shall be excused for coming in my boots." "Poh, never mind your boots. The point. Come at once to the point of the story." "Oh, I will, my good lord, in a moment. I walked here. I would not even wait to get the carriage ready. It would have taken time, you know. Now there is a market exactly in the road by which I had to pass. Your lordship may perhaps recollect the market, do you?" "To be sure I do. Go on, Curren, go on with the story." "I am very glad your lordship remembers the market, for I totally forget the name of it." The name. What the devil signifies the name of it, sir? It's the Castle Market. Your lordship is perfectly right. It is called the Castle Market. Well, I was passing through that very identical Castle Market when I observed a butcher preparing to kill a calf. He had a huge knife in his hand. It was as sharp as a razor. The calf was standing beside him. He drew the knife to plunge it into the animal. Just as he was in the act of doing so, a little boy about 4 years old, his only son, the loveliest little baby I ever saw, ran suddenly across his path, and he killed, oh, my God, he killed—" "The child, the child, the child!" vociferated Lord Avonmore. "No, my lord, the calf," continued Curren, very coolly. "He killed the calf. But your lordship is in the habit of anticipating." His first client. When Curren was called to the bar, he was without friends, without connections, without fortune, conscious of talents far above the mob by which he was elbowed, and cursed with sensibility which rendered him painfully alive to the mortifications he was fated to experience. Those who have risen to professional eminence, and recollect the impediments of such a commencement, the neglect abroad, the poverty, perhaps at home, the frowns of rivalry, the fears of friendship, the sneer at the first essay, the prophecy that it will be the last, discouragement as to the present, forebodings as to the future, some who are established endeavoring to crush the chance of competition, and some who have failed, anxious for the wretched consolation of companionship. Those who recollect the comforts of such an apprenticeship may duly appreciate poor Curren's situation. After toiling for a very inadequate recompense at the sessions of Cork, and wearing, as he said himself, his teeth almost to their stumps, he proceeded to the metropolis, taking for his wife and young children a miserable lodging on Hog Hill. Term after term, without either profit or professional reputation, he paced the hall of the Four Courts. Yet even thus he was not altogether undistinguished. If his pocket was not heavy, his heart was light. He was young and ardent, buoyed up not less by the consciousness of what he felt within than by the encouraging comparison with those who were successful around him, and his station among the crowd of idlers, whom he amused with his wit or amused by his eloquence. Many even who had emerged from that crowd did not disdain occasionally to glean from his conversation the rich and varied treasures which he did not fail to squander with the most unsparing prodigality. And some there were who observed the brightness of the infant luminary struggling through the obscurity that clouded its commencement. Among those who had the discrimination to appreciate and the heart to feel for him, luckily for Curren, was Mr. Arthur Wolfe, afterwards the unfortunate but respected Lord Kilwarden. The first fee of any consequence that he received was through his recommendation, and his recital of the incident cannot be without its interest to the young professional aspirant whom a temporary neglect may have sunk into dejection. "I then lived," said he, "upon Hog Hill. My wife and children were the chief furniture of my apartments; and as to my rent, it stood much the same chance of its liquidation with the national debt. Mrs. Curren, however, was a barrister's lady, and what was wanting in wealth she was well determined should be supplied by dignity. The landlady, on the other hand, had no idea of any other gradation, except that of pounds, shillings, and pence. I walked out one morning in order to avoid the perpetual altercations on the subject, with my mind, you may imagine, in no very enviable temperament. I fell into gloom, to which from my infancy I had been occasionally subject. I had a family for whom I had no dinner, and a landlady for whom I had no rent. I had gone abroad in despondence. I returned home almost in desperation. When I opened the door of my study, where Lavater alone could have found a library, the first object that presented itself was an immense folio of a brief, 20 golden guineas wrapped up beside it, and the name of Old Bob Lyons marked on the back of it. I paid my landlady, bought a good dinner, gave Bob Lyons a share of it, and that dinner was the date of my prosperity. Curren and the Informer. The following is an extract from Curren's speech delivered before a committee of the House of Lords against the Bill of Attainder on Lord Edward's property. "I have been asked," said he, "by the committee, whether I have any defensive evidence. I am confounded by such a question. Where is there a possibility of obtaining defensive evidence? Where am I to seek it? I have often of late gone to the dungeon of the captive, but never have I gone to the grave of the dead to receive instructions for his defence, nor in truth have I ever before been at the trial of a dead man. I offer therefore no evidence upon this inquiry, against the perilous example of which I do protest on behalf of the public, and against the cruelty and inhumanity and injustice of which I do protest in the name of the dead father, whose memory is sought to be dishonored, and of his infant orphans, whose bread is sought to be taken away. Some observations, and but a few, upon the evidence of the informer I will make. I do believe all he has admitted respecting himself. I do verily believe him in that instance, even though I heard him assert it upon his oath, by his own confession, an informer, and a bribed informer, a man whom respectable witnesses had sworn in a court of justice upon their oaths not to be credible on his oath, a man upon whose single testimony no jury ever did or ever ought to pronounce a verdict of guilty, a kind of man to whom the law resorts with abhorrence and from necessity in order to set the criminal against the crime, but who is made use of for the same reason that the most obnoxious poisons are resorted to in medicine. If such be the man, look for a moment at his story. He confines himself to mere conversation only with a dead man. He ventures not to introduce any third person, living or even dead. He ventures to state no act whatever done. He wishes, indeed, to asperse the conduct of Lady Edward Fitzgerald, but he well knew that, even were she in this country, she could not be called as a witness to contradict him. See therefore if there be any one assertion to which credit can be given except this, that he was sworn and forsworn, that he is a traitor, that he has received 500 guineas to be an informer, and that his general reputation is to be utterly unworthy of credit. He concludes thus: every act of this sort ought to have a practical morality flowing from its principle. If loyalty and justice require that those children should be deprived of bread, must it not be a violation of that principle to give them food or shelter? Must not every loyal and just man wish to see them, in the words of the famous Golden Bull, always poor and necessitous, and for ever accompanied by the infamy of the father, languishing in continued indigence, and finding their punishment in living, and their relief in dying? If the widowed mother should carry the orphan heir of her unfortunate husband to the gate of any man who himself touched with the sad vicissitude of human affairs, might feel a compassionate reverence for the noble blood that flowed in his veins, nobler than the royalty that first ennobled it, that, like a rich stream, rose till it ran and hid its fountain, if, remembering the many noble qualities of his unfortunate father, his heart melted over the calamities of the child, if his heart swelled, if his eyes overflowed, if his too precipitate hand was stretched forth by his pity or his gratitude to the excommunicated sufferers. How could he justify the rebel tear or the traitorous humanity? One word more, and I have done. I once more earnestly and solemnly conjure you to reflect that the fact, I mean the fact of guilt or innocence, which must be the foundation of this bill, is now, after the death of this party, capable of being tried, consistent with the liberty of a free people, or the unalterable rules of eternal justice, and that as to the forfeiture and the ignominy which it enacts, that only can be punishment which lights upon guilt, and that can be only vengeance which breaks upon innocence. Curren was one day setting his watch at the post office, which was then opposite the late Parliament House, when a noble member of the House of Lords said to him, "Curren, what do they mean to do with that useless building? For my part, I am sure I hate even the sight of it." "I do not wonder at it, my lord," replied Curren contemptuously. "I never yet heard of a murderer who was not afraid of a ghost." Lord Clare. One day, when it was known that Curren had to make an elaborate argument in Chancery, Lord Clare brought a large Newfoundland dog upon the bench with him, and during the progress of the argument he lent his ear much more to the dog than to the barrister. This was observed at length by the entire profession. In time the Chancellor lost all regard for decency. He turned himself quite aside in the most material part of the case, and began in full court to fondle the animal. Curren stopped at once. Go on, Mr. Curren," said Lord Clare. "Oh, I beg 1,000 pardons, my lord. I really took it for granted that your lordship was employed in consultation." Curren's eloquence. In a debate on attachments in the Irish House of Commons in 1785, Mr. Curren rose to speak against them, and perceiving Mr. Fitzgibbon, the Attorney General, afterwards Lord Clare, had fallen asleep on his seat, he thus commenced: "I hope I may say a few words on this great subject without disturbing the sleep of any right honourable member, and yet perhaps I ought rather to envy than blame the tranquillity of the right honourable gentleman. I do not feel myself so happily tempered as to be lulled to repose by the storms that shake the land. If they invited any to rest, that rest ought not to be lavished on the guilty spirit." Although Mr. Curren appears here to have commenced hostilities, it should be mentioned that he was apprised of Mr. Fitzgibbon's having given out in the ministerial circles that he would take an opportunity during the debate, in which he knew that Mr. Curren would take part, of putting down the young patriot. The Duchess of Rutland and all the ladies of the castle were present in the gallery to witness what Mr. Curren called in the course of the debate this exhibition by command. When Mr. Curren sat down, Mr. Fitzgibbon, provoked by the expressions he had used, and by the general tenor of his observation, replied with much personality, and, among other things, denominated Mr. Curren a puny babbler. Mr. C. retorted by the following description of his opponent: "I am not a man whose respect in person and character depends upon the importance of his office. I am not a young man who thrusts himself into the foreground of a picture which ought to be occupied by a better figure. I am not one who replies with invective when sinking under the weight of argument. I am not a man who denies the necessity of parliamentary reform at the time that he approves of its expediency, by reviling his own constituents, the parish clerk, the sexton, and the grave digger. And if there be any man who can apply what I am not to himself, I leave him to think of it in the committee, and contemplate upon it when he goes home. The result of this night's debate was a duel between Mr. Curren and Mr. Fitzgibbon. After exchanging shots they separated, but confirmed in their feeling of mutual aversion. At the assizes at Cork, Curren had once just entered upon his case, and stated the facts to the jury. He then, with his usual impressiveness and pathos, appealed to their feelings, and was concluding the whole with this sentence: "Thus, gentlemen, I trust I have made the innocence of that persecuted man as clear to you as—" At that instant the sun, which had hitherto been overclouded, shot its rays into the court house. "As clear to you," continued he, "as yonder sunbeam, which now burst in among us, and supplies me with its splendid illustration." Scene between Fitzgibbon and Curran in the Irish Parliament. Mr. Fitzgibbon, afterwards Lord Clare, rose and said, "The politically insane gentleman has asserted much, but he only emitted some effusions of the witticisms of fancy. His declamation, indeed, was better calculated for the stage of Sadler's Wells than the floor of the House of Commons. A mountebank, with but one half of the honorable gentleman's talent for rant, would undoubtedly make his fortune. However, I am somewhat surprised he should entertain such a particular asperity against me, as I never did him a favor. But perhaps the honorable gentleman imagines he may talk himself into consequence. If so, I should be sorry to obstruct his promotion. He is heartily welcome to attack me. Of one thing only I will assure him, that I hold him in so small a degree of estimation, either as a man or as a lawyer, that I shall never hereafter deign to make him any answer." Mr. Curran: "The honorable gentleman says I have poured forth some witticisms of fancy. That is a charge I shall never be able to retort upon him. He says I am insane. For my part, were I the man who, when all debate had subsided, who, when the bill was given up, had risen to make an inflammatory speech against my country, I should be obliged to any friend who would excuse my conduct by attributing it to insanity. Were I the man who could commit a murder on the reputation of my country, I should thank the friend who would excuse my conduct by attributing it to insanity. Were I a man possessed of so much arrogance as to set up my own little head against the opinions of the nation, I should thank the friend who would say, 'Heed him not, he is insane.' Nay, if I were such a man, I would thank the friend who had sent me to Bedlam. If I knew one man who was easily roused and easily appeased, I would not give his character as that of the whole nation. The right honorable gentleman says he never came here with written speeches. I never suspected him of it, and I believe there is not a gentleman in the House who, having heard what has fallen from him, would ever suspect him of writing speeches. But I will not pursue him further. I will not enter into a conflict in which victory can gain no honor." His defence of Archibald Hamilton Rowan. The following extracts, commencing with a description of Mr. Rowan, will be found interesting. Gentlemen, let me suggest another observation or two, if still you have any doubt as to the guilt or the innocence of the defendant. Give me leave to suggest to you what circumstances you ought to consider in order to found your verdict. You should consider the character of the person accused, and in this your task is easy. I will venture to say, there is not a man in this nation more known than the gentleman who is the subject of this persecution, not only by the part he has taken in public concerns, and which he has taken in common with many, but still more so by that extraordinary sympathy for human affliction which, I am sorry to think, he shares with so small a number. There is not a day that you hear the cries of your starving manufacturers in your streets, that you do not also see the advocate of their sufferings, that you do not see his honest and manly figure, with uncovered head, soliciting for their relief, searching the frozen heart of charity for every string that can be touched by compassion, and urging the force of every argument and every motive, save that which his modesty suppresses, the authority of his own generous example. Or if you see him not there, you may trace his steps to the abode of disease and famine and despair. The messenger of heaven, bearing with him food and medicine and consolation. Are these the materials of which we suppose anarchy and public rapine to be formed? Is this the man on whom to fasten the abominable charge of goading on a frantic populace to mutiny and bloodshed? Is this the man likely to apostatize from every principle that can bind him to the state, his birth, his property, his education, his character, and his children? Let me tell you, gentlemen of the jury, if you agree with his prosecutors in thinking there ought to be a sacrifice of such a man, on such an occasion, and upon the credit of such evidence, you are to convict him. Never can you give a sentence consigning any man to public punishment with less danger to his person or to his fame. For where could the hireling be found to fling contumely or ingratitude at his head, whose private distress he had not labored to alleviate, or whose public condition he had not labored to improve? Speaking of the liberty of the press, he says, "What then remains? The liberty of the press only, that sacred palladium which no influence, no power, no government, which nothing but the folly or the depravity, or the folly or the corruption of a jury ever can destroy. And what calamities are the people saved from by having public communication kept open to them? I will tell you, gentlemen, what they are saved from. I will tell you also to what both are exposed by shutting up that communication. In one case, sedition speaks aloud and walks abroad. The demagogue goes forth, the public eye is upon him, he frets his busy hour upon the stage, but soon either weariness or bribe or punishment or disappointment bears him down, or drives him off, and he appears no more. In the other case, how does the work of sedition go forward? Night after night the muffled rebel steals forth in the dark, and casts another brand upon the pile, to which, when the hour of fatal maturity shall arrive, he will apply the flame. If you doubt of the horrid consequences of suppressing the effusion of even individual discontent, look to those enslaved countries where the protection of despotism is supposed to be secured by such restraints. Even the person of the despot there is never in safety. Neither the fears of the despot nor the machinations of the slave have any slumber, the one anticipating the moment of peril, the other watching the opportunity of aggression. The fatal crisis is equally a surprise upon both. The decisive instant is precipitated without warning, by folly on the one side, or by frenzy on the other; and there is no notice of the treason till the traitor acts. In those unfortunate countries one cannot read it without horror. There are officers whose province it is to have the water which is to be drank by their rulers, sealed up in bottles, lest some wretched miscreant should throw poison into the draught. But, gentlemen, if you wish for a nearer and a more interesting example, you have it in the history of your own revolution. You have it in that memorable period when the monarch found a servile acquiescence in the ministers of his folly, when the liberty of the press was trodden under foot, when venal sheriffs returned packed juries to carry into effect those fatal conspiracies of the few against the many, when the devoted benches of public justice were filled by some of those foundlings of fortune who, overwhelmed in the torrent of corruption at an early period, lay at the bottom like drowned bodies, while sanity remained in them, becoming buoyant by putrefaction. They rose as they rotted, and floated to the surface of the polluted stream, where they were drifted along, the objects of terror and contagion and abomination. In that awful moment of a nation's travail, of the last gasp of tyranny, and the first breath of freedom, how pregnant is the example! The press extinguished, the people enslaved, and the prince undone. As the advocate of society, therefore, of peace, of domestic liberty, and the lasting union of the two countries, I conjure you to guard the liberty of the press, that great sentinel of the state, that grand detector of public imposture. Guard it, because when it sinks, there sink with it, in one common grave, the liberty of the subject and the security of the crown. Gentlemen, I am glad that this question has not been brought forward earlier. I rejoice, for the sake of the court, the jury, and of the public repose, that this question has not been brought forward till now. In Great Britain analogous circumstances have taken place. At the commencement of that unfortunate war which has deluged Europe with blood, the spirit of the English people was tremblingly alive to the terror of French principles. At that moment of general paroxysm, to accuse was to convict. The danger loomed larger to the public eye from the misty region through which it was surveyed. We measured inaccessible heights by the shadows they project, when the lowness and the distance of the light form the length of the shade. There is a sort of aspiring and adventurous credulity which disdains assenting to obvious truths, and delights in catching at the improbabilities of a case as its best ground of faith. To what other cause, gentlemen, can you ascribe that, in the wise, the reflecting, and the philosophic nation of Great Britain, a printer has been gravely found guilty of libel for publishing those resolutions to which the present minister of that kingdom had already subscribed his name? To what other cause can you ascribe, what in my mind is still more astonishing, in such a country as Scotland, a nation cast in the happy medium between the spiritless acquiescence of submissive poverty and the sturdy credulity of pampered wealth, cool and ardent, adventurous and persevering, winging her eagle flight against the blaze of every science, with an eye that never winks, and a wing that never tires, crowned as she is with the spoils of every art, and decked with the wreath of every muse, from the deep and scrutinizing researches of her Hume, to the sweet and simple, but not less sublime and pathetic, morality of her Burns. How, from the bosom of a country like that, genius and character and talents, Muir, Marigot, etc., should be banished to a distant and barbarous soil, condemned to pine under the horrid communion of vulgar vice and base-born profligacy, twice the period that ordinary calculation gives to the continuance of human life. But I will not further press any idea that is painful to me, and I am sure must be painful to you. I will only say you have now an example of which neither England nor Scotland had the advantage. You have the example of the panic, the infatuation, and the contrition of both. It is now for you to decide whether you will profit by their experience of idle panic and idle regret, or whether you meanly prefer to palliate a servile imitation of their frailty by a paltry affectation of their repentance. It is now for you to show that you are not carried away by the same hectic delusions, to acts of which no tears can wash away the fatal consequences or the indelible reproach. He thus speaks of the volunteers of Ireland: "Gentlemen, Mr. Attorney General has thought proper to direct your attention to the state and circumstances of public affairs at the time of this transaction. Let me also make a few retrospective observations on a period at which he has but slightly glanced. You know, gentlemen, that France has espoused the cause of America, and we became thereby involved in a war with that nation. Heu, nescia mens hominum futuri." Little did that ill-fated monarch know that he was forming the first cause of those disastrous events that were to end in the subversion of his throne, in the slaughter of his family, and the deluging of his country with the blood of his people. You cannot but remember that a time when we had scarcely a regular soldier for our defence, when the old and young were alarmed and terrified with apprehensions of a descent upon our coasts, that Providence seemed to have worked a sort of miracle in our favor. You saw a band of armed men at the great call of nature, of honor, and their country. You saw men of the greatest wealth and rank. You saw every class of the community give up its members and send them armed into the field to protect the public and private tranquillity of Ireland. It is impossible for any man to turn back to that period without reviving those sentiments of tenderness and gratitude which then beat in the public bosom. To recollect amidst what applause, what tears, what prayers, what benedictions, they walked forth amongst spectators, agitated by the mingled sensations of terror and of reliance, of danger and of protection, imploring the blessings of heaven upon their heads, and its conquest upon their swords. That illustrious and adored and abused body of men stood forward and assumed the title, which I trust the ingratitude of their country will never blot from its history, the Volunteers of Ireland. He thus speaks of the national representation of the people: "Gentlemen, the representation of our people is the vital principle of their political existence. Without it they are dead, or they live only to servitude. Without it there are two estates acting upon and against the third, instead of acting in cooperation with it. Without it, if the people are oppressed by their judges, where is the tribunal to which the offender shall be amenable? Without it, if they are trampled upon and plundered by a minister, where is the tribunal to which the offender shall be amenable? Without it, where is the ear to hear, or the heart to feel, or the hand to redress their sufferings? Shall they be found, let me ask you, in the accursed bands of imps and minions that bask in their disgrace, and fatten upon their spoils, and flourish upon their ruin? But let me not put this to you as a merely speculative question. It is a plain question of fact. Rely on it, physical man is everywhere the same. It is only the various operation of moral causes that gives variety to the social or individual character or condition. How otherwise happens it that modern slavery looks quietly at the despot on the very spot where Leonidas expired? The answer is, Sparta has not changed her climate, but she has lost that government which her liberty could not survive. End of section 3. Recording by JCarson. Section 4 of Irish Wit and Humor. The author is anonymous. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by JCarson. John Philpot Curren, Part 2. Speaking of universal emancipation, he says: "This paper, gentlemen, insists on the necessity of emancipating the Catholics of Ireland, and that is charged as part of the libel. If they had waited another year, if they had kept this prosecution pending for another year, how much would remain for a jury to decide upon? I should be at a loss to discover. It seems as if the progress of public information was eating away the ground of prosecution. Since its commencement, this part of the libel has unluckily received the sanction of the legislature. In that interval, our Catholic brethren have reobtained that admission which, it seems, it was a libel to propose. In what way to account for this, I am really at a loss. Have any alarms been occasioned by the emancipation of our Catholic brethren? Has the bigoted malignity of any individual been crushed? Or has the stability of the government or that of the country been weakened? Or is 1 million of subjects stronger than 4 millions? Do you think that the benefit they have received should be poisoned by the sting of vengeance? If you think so, you must say to them, you have demanded emancipation, and you have got it. But we abhor your persons. We are outraged at your success, and we will stigmatize by a criminal prosecution the adviser of that relief which you have obtained from the voice of your country. I ask you, do you think, as honest men, anxious for the public tranquillity, conscious that there are wounds not yet completely cicatrized, that you ought to speak this language at this time to men who are very much disposed to think that, in this very emancipation, they have been saved from their own Parliament by the humanity of their own sovereign? Or do you wish to prepare them for the revocation of these improvident concessions? Do you think it wise or humane at this moment to insult them by sticking up in a pillory the man who dared to stand forth as their advocate? I put it to your oaths. Do you think that a blessing of that kind, that a victory obtained by justice over bigotry and oppression, should have a stigma cast upon it by an ignominious sentence upon men bold enough and honest enough to propose that measure? To propose the redeeming of religion from the abuses of the church, the reclaiming of 3 millions of men from bondage, and giving liberty to all who had a right to demand it. Giving, I say, in the so much censured words of this paper, giving universal emancipation. I speak in the spirit of the British law, which makes liberty commensurate with and inseparable from British soil, which proclaims even to the stranger and sojourner, the moment he sets his foot upon British earth, that the ground on which he treads is holy and consecrated by the genius of universal emancipation. No matter in what language his doom may have been pronounced, no matter what complexion, incompatible with freedom, an Indian or an African sun may have burnt on him, no matter in what disastrous battle the helm of his liberty may been cloven down, no matter with what solemnities he may have been devoted upon the altar of slavery, the moment he touches the sacred soil of Britain, the altar and the God sink together in the dust. His soul walks abroad in its own majesty. His body swells beyond the measure of his chains, which burst from around him, and he stands redeemed, regenerated, and disenthralled by the irresistible genius of universal emancipation. Mr. Curren was here interrupted with the loud and irresistible acclamations of all within hearing, when, after a long interval, the enthusiasm had in some degree subsided, he thus modestly alluded to the incident: "Gentlemen, I am not such a fool as to ascribe any effusion of this sort to any merit of mine. It is the mighty theme, and not the inconsiderable advocate, that can excite interest in the hearer. What you hear is but the testimony which nature bears to her own character. It is the effusion of her gratitude to that power which stamped that character upon her." He concludes with this brilliant peroration: "Upon this subject, therefore, credit me when I say I am still more anxious for you than I can possibly be for him. Not the jury of his own choice, which the law of England allows, but which ours refuses, collected in that box by a person certainly no friend to Mr. Rowan, certainly not very deeply interested in giving him a very impartial jury. Feeling this, as I am persuaded you do, you cannot be surprised, however you may be distressed, at the mournful presage with which an anxious public is led to fear the worst from your possible determination. But I will not, for the justice and honor of our common country, suffer my mind to be borne away by such melancholy anticipation. I will not relinquish the confidence that this day will be the period of his sufferings, and however mercilessly he has been hitherto pursued, that your verdict will send him home to the arms of his family and the wishes of his country. But if, which heaven forbid, it hath still been unfortunately determined that because he has not bent to power and authority, because he would not bow down before the golden calf and worship it, he is to be bound and cast into the furnace, I do trust in God there is a redeeming spirit in the Constitution, which will be seen to walk with the sufferer through the flames, and to preserve him unhurt by the conflagration." After this brilliant speech, when Curren made his appearance outside the court, he was surrounded by the populace who had assembled to chair him. He begged of them to desist, in a commanding tone; but a gigantic chairman, eyeing Curren from top to toe, cried out to his companion, "Arrah! blood and turf! Pat, don't mind the little darlin'. Pitch him upon my shoulder." He was accordingly carried to his carriage and drawn home by the people. ENCOUNTER with a fishwoman. There was a fishwoman in Cork who was more than a match for the whole fraternity of her order. She could only be matched by Mrs. Scutcheen, of Patrick Street, Dublin, the lady who used to boast of her bag of farthings, and regale herself before each encounter with a pen'orth of "the droppin's of the cock." Curren was passing the quay at Cork, where this virago held forth, when, stopping to listen to her, he was requested to go on out that. Hesitating to retreat as quick as the lady wished, she opened a broadside upon Curren, who returned fire with such effect as to bring forth the applause of the surrounding sisterhood. She was vanquished for the first time, though she had been 30 years on the stones of the quay. Curren and Lord Erskine. Dr. Crowley, in speaking of the two great forensic orators of the day, draws a comparison between the circumstances under which both addressed their audiences. When Erskine pleaded, he stood in the midst of a secure nation, and pleaded like a priest of the temple of justice, with his hand on the altar of the Constitution, and all England waiting to treasure every deluding oracle that came from his lips. Curren pleaded, not in a time when the public system was only so far disturbed as to give additional interest to his eloquence, but in a time when the system was threatened with instant dissolution, when society seemed to be falling in fragments round him, when the soil was already throwing up flames. Rebellion was in arms. He pleaded, not on the floor of a shrine, but on a scaffold, with no companions but the wretched and culpable beings who were to be flung from it, hour by hour, and no hearers but the crowd who rushed in desperate anxiety to that spot of hurried execution, and then rushed away, eager to shake off all remembrance of scenes which had torn every heart among them. His duel with Bully Egan. When Curren and Bully Egan met on the ground, the latter complained of the advantage his antagonist had over him, and declared that he was as easily hit as a turf stack, while, as to firing at Curren, he might as well fire at a razor's edge. Whereupon Curren waggishly proposed that his size should be chalked out upon Egan's side, and that every shot which hits outside that mark should go for nothing. Massey versus Headford. The following extract is from his celebrated speech against the Marquis of Headford. Never so clearly as in the present instance have I observed that safeguard of justice which Providence has placed in the nature of man. Such is the imperious dominion with which truth and reason wave their sceptre over the human intellect, that no solicitation, however artful, no talent, however commanding, can seduce it from its allegiance. In proportion to the humility of our submission to its rule, do we rise into some faint emulation of that ineffable and presiding divinity, whose characteristic attribute it is to be coerced and bound by the inexorable laws of its own nature, so as to be all wise and all just from necessity rather than election. You have seen it in the learned advocate who has preceded me, most peculiarly and strikingly illustrated. You have seen even his great talents, perhaps the first in any country, languishing under a cause too weak to carry him, and too heavy to be carried by him. He was forced to dismiss his natural candor and sincerity, and having no merits in his case, to take refuge in the dignity of his own manner, the resources of his own ingenuity, from the overwhelming difficulties with which he was surrounded. Wretched client, unhappy advocate, what a combination do you form! But such is the condition of guilt. Its commission mean and tremulous, its defence artificial and insincere, its prosecution candid and simple, its condemnation dignified and austere. Such has been the defendant's guilt, such his defence, such shall be my address to you, and such, I trust, your verdict. The learned counsel has told me that this unfortunate woman is not to be estimated at 40,000 pounds. Fatal and unquestionable is the truth of this assertion. Alas! gentlemen, she is no longer worth anything. Faded, fallen, degraded, and disgraced, she is worth less than nothing. But it is for the honor, the hope, the expectation, the tenderness, and the comforts that have been blasted by the defendant, and have fled forever, that you are to remunerate the plaintiff by the punishment of the defendant. It is not her present value which you are to weigh, but it is her value at that time, when she sat basking in a husband's love, with the blessing of heaven on her head, and its purity in her heart; when she sat amongst her family, and administered the morality of the parental board. Estimate that past value, compare it with its present deplorable diminution, and it may lead you to form some judgment of the severity of the injury and the extent of the compensation. The learned counsel has told you, you ought to be cautious, because your verdict cannot be set aside for excess. The assertion is just, but has he treated you fairly by its application? His cause would not allow him to be fair, for why is the rule adopted in this single action? Because, this being peculiarly an injury to the most susceptible of all human feelings, it leaves the injury of the husband to be ascertained by the sensibility of the jury, and does not presume to measure the justice of their determination by the cold and chilly exercise of its own discretion. In any other action it is easy to calculate. If a tradesman's arm is cut off, you can measure the loss he has sustained, but the wound of feeling and the agony of the heart cannot be judged by any standard with which I am acquainted. And you are unfairly dealt with when you are called on to appreciate the present sufferings of the husband by the present guilt, delinquency, and degradation of his wife. As well might you, if called on to give compensation to a man for the murder of his dearest friend, find the measure of his injury by weighing the ashes of the dead. But it is not, gentlemen of the jury, by weighing the ashes of the dead that you would estimate the loss of the survivor. The learned counsel has referred you to other cases and other countries for instances of moderate verdicts. I can refer you to some authentic instances of just ones. In the next county, 15,000 pounds against a subaltern officer. In Travers and McCarthy, 5,000 pounds against a servant. In Tye against Jones, 1,000 pounds against a man not worth a shilling. What then ought to be the rule, where rank and power and wealth and station have combined to render the example of his crime more dangerous, to make his guilt more odious, to make the injury to the plaintiff more grievous, because more conspicuous? I affect no levelling familiarity when I speak of persons in the higher ranks of society. Distinctions of orders are necessary, and I always feel disposed to treat them with respect. But when it is my duty to speak of the crimes by which they are degraded, I am not so fastidious as to shrink from their contact, when to touch them is essential to their dissection. However, therefore, I should feel on any other occasion a disposition to speak of the noble defendant with the respect due his situation, and perhaps to his qualities, of which he may have many to redeem him from the odium of this transaction. I cannot so indulge myself here. I cannot betray my client to avoid the pain of doing my duty. I cannot forget that in this action the condition, the conduct, and circumstances of the parties are justly and peculiarly the objects of your consideration. Who then are the parties? The plaintiff, young, amiable, of family and education, of the generous disinterestedness of his heart, you can form an opinion, even from the evidence of the defendant, that he declined an alliance which would have added to his fortune and consideration, and which he rejected for an unportioned union with his present wife. She too, at that time, young, beautiful, and accomplished, and feeling her affection for her husband increase, in proportion as she remembered the ardor of his love and the sincerity of his sacrifice. Look now to the defendant. Can you behold him without shame and indignation? With what feelings can you regard a rank that he has so tarnished, and a patent that he has so worse than cancelled? High in the army, high in the state, the hereditary counsellor of the king, of wealth incalculable, and to this last I advert with an indignant and contemptuous satisfaction, because, as the only instrument of his guilt and shame, it will be the means of his punishment and the source of his compensation. The serenading lover. In the very zenith of Curren's professional career, he was consulted in a case of extremely novel character, which arose out of the following circumstances. Not many doors from Eden Quay, in Upper Sackville Street, lived a young lady of very fascinating manners, and whose beauty had attracted considerable attention wherever she made her appearance. Amongst the many gentlemen whose hearts she had touched, and whose heads she had deranged, was one young Englishman, a graduate of Trinity College, and about as fair a specimen of the reverse of beauty as ever took the chair at a dinner of the Ugly Fellows Club. Strange to say, he above all others was the person on whom she looked with any favor. Men of rank and fortune had sought her hand, lords and commoners had sought the honor of an introduction, but no, none for her but the ugly man. In vain did the ladies of her acquaintance quiz her about her taste. In vain did her family remonstrate upon the folly of her conduct in refusing men of station for such an individual. No go, none for her but the ugly man. Her dear papa only seemed to take the affair in a quiet way. Not that he was indifferent about the matter, but he loved her too much to throw any obstacle in the way of her happiness. Not so, however, with her brother, a splendid young fellow, whose mortification was intense, especially as the whole affair was the theme of ridicule among his fellow students in old Trinity. He, though sharing in all the love and tenderness of the father, could not understand his quiet resignation. What is it to be thought of that one who was the butt of the university, one on whom nature had played her fantastic tricks, should be the person who held the key to his lovely sister's heart? No, the father might resign himself to this quiet philosophy, but he, at least, would have none of it. It should never be said within the college walls that he looked tamely on while a farce of this kind was being played out, especially as some of his most intimate fellow students, and a beloved one in particular, took more than a common interest in the matter. On a summer morning, in the middle of July, he was coming out of his hall door, when the postman handed him 2 letters, one of which was directed to his sister. Suspecting the party from whom it came, and that a knowledge of its contents might lead to some discovery useful to him in frustrating the writer's designs, he opened it, and found that his suspicion was correct, and that himself was the object of complaint for his manner towards him in college; and further, that as he was about to leave for England on the following day, and would not return for some weeks, he would do himself the honor of serenading her at 12 o'clock that night. After reading the letter, his first thought was to look to the condition of his horsewhip; but after a little quiet reflection, he resolved upon another plan of action. Breakfast over, he proceeded to the kitchen, summoned all the servants to his presence, to whom he related the whole story from beginning to end, and proposed that they should drench him with water when he made his appearance under the window. But there happened to be among them a corpulent lady called Betty Devine, who entered a plea of objection to that mode of proceeding on the grounds of waste of water; that in Edinburgh, where she had served for 7 years, they wouldn't think of such waste; and that if the young master would only leave the matter in her hands, she would drown the musician in a chorus, the like of which was not to be heard outside the boundaries of bonny Scotland. To this proposition on the part of Betty the young gentleman gave a hearty assent, adding at the same time a hope that her want of practice since she had left Edinburgh would be no obstacle to her success. To which Miss Devine replied by asking him to name the window out of which she was to present her compliments to the English minstrel. "As to that, Betty," said he, "I leave you to select your own ground, but take care that you don't miss fire;" an observation which took the stable boy, Bill Mack, by the greatest surprise, as, from Betty's powers of administration in his regard, a faded dark brown coat the master gave him had been restored to its original colour. For once in her lifetime Betty found herself mistress of her situation, and having made her arrangements, dispatched Bill Mack with an invitation to some of her stable friends of the Quay to witness the forthcoming concert at 12 o'clock that night. Scarcely had the hour arrived, however, when the serenader made his appearance, dressed in the pink of fashion, and placing himself under his lady's window, proceeded to play the guitar in the best style. The performance hadn't well commenced, when, throwing his eye to her lattice high, he beheld a female figure in the 2-pair window, which she opened gently, then commenced his best effort in the art divine. No doubt it was the lady of his love that was there, about to reward him with nature's choice gifts from above, not the wax artificials of these days, but the real gems, which he hoped to preserve on his passage to England. That he saw a female figure was but too true. It was Miss Betty Devine, who had been arranging that portion of her toilet which might endanger the free exercise of her right arm. This done, Miss Devine stood forward, and grasping a certain utensil of more than ordinary proportions, with one bound not only returned its lining on the night, as Tom Moore says, but also on the head of the devoted serenader, who was so stunned by Betty's favour that it was some time before he realized the nature of the gift. His nasal organ having settled all doubt in that respect, he made his way from the crowd, vowing law and vengeance. "What is the matter?" asked a popular commoner on his way from the Parliament House to one of the boys of the Quay. "It's a constart, your honour, given by Betty de Scotch girl. De creature's fond of harmony, and for my part the tongue is sticking to the roof of my mouth from the fair dint of de chorus. I didn't taste a drop since mornin'. Aye, boys, ain't ye all dry?" This appeal having met with a favourable response, the gentlemen of the Quay retired to drink his honour's health and to wash down the music. Meanwhile, the next morning the serenading gentleman went in all haste to his brother-in-law, one of the leading merchants of the city, to whom he communicated the occurrence of the previous night. He had scarcely finished when the merchant took him off to his attorney, who, without further delay, went with them to the residence of Curren, to have his opinion on the case. When they had finished, Curren at once gave his opinion. "Gentlemen," said he, "in this country, when we go to see a friend or acquaintance, all we ever expect is pot luck." Carew O'Dwyer was the first who had the honor of proposing that Curren's remains should be brought over from England and laid in Glasnevin. Charles Phillip's first introduction to Curren took place at the Priory, a country villa about 4 miles from Dublin. Curren would have no one to introduce him, but went and took him by the hand. Lundy Foot, the tobacconist, was on the table under examination, and hesitating to answer, "Lundy, Lundy," said Curren, "that's a poser, a devil of a pinch." Employment of informers. I speak not of the fate of those horrid wretches who have been so often transferred from the table to the dock, and from the dock to the pillory. I speak of what your own eyes have seen, day after day, during the course of this commission, from the box where you are now sitting. The number of horrid miscreants who avowed upon their oaths that they had come from the seat of government, from the castle, where they had been worked upon by the fear of death and the hopes of compensation, to give evidence against their fellows; that the mild and wholesome counsels of this government are holden over these catacombs of living death, where the wretch that is buried a man lies till his heart has time to fester and dissolve, and is then dug up a witness. Is this fancy, or is it fact? Have you not seen him, after his resurrection from that tomb, after having been dug out of the region of death and corruption, make his appearance upon the table, the living image of life and of death, and the supreme arbiter of both? Have you not marked, when he entered, how the stormy wave of the multitude retired at his approach? Have you not marked how the human heart bowed to the supremacy of his power in the undissembled homage of deferential horror? How his glance, like the lightning of heaven, seemed to rive the body of the accused, and mark it for the grave, while his voice warned the devoted wretch of life and death, a death which no innocence can escape, no art elude, no force resist, no antidote preserve. There was an antidote, a juror's oath, but even that adamantine chain, which bound the integrity of man to the throne of eternal justice, is solved and molten in the breath that issues from the informer's mouth. Conscience swings from her mooring, and the appalled and affrighted juror consults his own safety in the surrender of his victim. Informers are worshipped in the temple of justice, even as the devil has been worshipped by pagans and savages. Even so in this wicked country is the informer an object of judicial idolatry. Even so is he soothed by the music of human groans. Even so is he placated and incensed by the fumes and by the blood of human sacrifices. Curren and the farmer. A farmer attending a fair with £100 in his pocket, took the precaution of depositing it in the hands of the landlord of the public house at which he stopped. Next day he applied for the money, but the host affected to know nothing of the business. In this dilemma the farmer consulted Curren. "Have patience, my friend," said the counsel. "Speak to the landlord civilly, and tell him you are convinced you must have left your money with some other person. Take a friend with you, and lodge with him another 100, and then come to me." The dupe doubted the advice, but Moved by the authority or rhetoric of the learned counsel, he at length followed it. "And now, sir," said he to Curren, "I don't see as I am to be better off for this, if I get my second hundred again. But how is that to be done?" "Go and ask him for it when he is alone," said the counsel. "Ay, sir, but asking won't do. I's afraid without my witness, at any rate." "Never mind, take my advice," said Curren. "Do as I bid you, and return to me." The farmer did so, and came back with his hundred, glad at any rate to find that safe again in his possession. "Now, sir, I suppose I must be content, but I don't see as I am much better off." "Well, then," said the counsel, "now take your friend with you, and ask the landlord for the £100 your friend saw you leave with him." It need not be added that the wily landlord found that he had been taken off his guard, whilst the farmer returned exultingly to thank his counsel with both hundreds in his pocket. Curren and the judge. Soon after Mr. Curren had been called to the bar, on some statement of Judge Robinson's, the young counsel observed that he had never met the law as laid down by his lordship in any book in his library. "That may be, sir," said the judge, "but I suspect that your library is very small." Mr. Curren replied, "I find it more instructive, my lord, to study good books than to compose bad ones. My good books may be few, but the title pages give me the writers' names, and my shelf is not disgraced by any such rank absurdities that their very authors are ashamed to own them." "Sir," said the judge, "you are forgetting the respect which you owe to the dignity of the judicial character." "Dignity!" exclaimed Mr. Curren. "My lord, upon that point I shall cite you a case from a book of some authority, with which you are perhaps not unacquainted." He then briefly recited the story of Strap in Roderick Random, who having stripped off his coat to fight, entrusted it to a bystander. When the battle was over, and he was well beaten, he turned to resume it, but the man had carried it off. Mr. Curren thus applied the tale: "So, my lord, when the person entrusted with the dignity of the judgment seat lays it aside for a moment to enter into a disgraceful personal contest, it is in vain when he has been worsted in the encounter that he seeks to resume it. It is in vain that he tries to shelter himself behind an authority which he has abandoned." "If you say another word, I'll commit you," replied the angry judge. To which Mr. Curren retorted, "If your lordship shall do so, we shall both of us have the consolation of reflecting that I am not the worst thing your lordship has committed." Curren's quarrel with Fitzgibbon. Curren distinguished himself not more as a barrister than as a member of Parliament, and in the latter character it was his misfortune to provoke the enmity of a man whose thirst for revenge was only to be satiated by the utter ruin of his adversary. In the discussion of a bill of a penal nature, Curren inveighed in strong terms against the Attorney General Fitzgibbon for sleeping on the bench when statutes of the most cruel kind were being enacted, and ironically lamented that the slumber of guilt should so nearly resemble the repose of innocence. A challenge from Fitzgibbon was the consequence of this sally, and the parties having met, were to fire when they chose. "I never," said Curren, when relating the circumstances of the duel, "I never saw any one whose determination seemed more malignant than Fitzgibbon's. After I had fired, he took aim at me for at least half a minute, and on its proving ineffectual, I could not help exclaiming to him, 'It was not your fault, Mr. Attorney, you were deliberate enough.' The Attorney General declared his honor satisfied, and here, at least for the time, the dispute appeared to terminate. Not here, however, terminated Fitzgibbon's animosity. Soon afterwards he became Lord Chancellor, and a peer of Ireland by the title of Lord Clare, and in the former capacity he found an opportunity, by means of his judicial authority, of ungenerously crashing the rising powers and fortunes of his late antagonist. Curren, who was at this time a leader, and one of the senior practitioners at the Chancery bar, soon felt all the force of his rival's vengeance. The Chancellor is said to have yielded a reluctant attention to every motion he made. He frequently stopped him in the middle of a speech, questioned his knowledge of law, recommended to him more attention to facts, in short, succeeded not only in crippling all his professional efforts, but actually in leaving him without a client. Curren indeed appeared as usual in the 3 other courts of the 4 courts at Dublin, but he had been already stripped of his most profitable practice, and as his expenses nearly kept pace with his gains, he was almost left a beggar, for all hopes of the wealth and honours of the long robe were now denied him. The memory of this persecution embittered the last moments of Curren's existence, and he could never even allude to it without evincing a just and excusable indignation. In a letter which he addressed to a friend 20 years after, he says, "I made no compromise with power. I had the merit of provoking and despising the personal malice of every man in Ireland who was the known enemy of the country. Without the walls of the Court of Justice, my character was pursued with the most persevering slander, and within those walls, though I was too strong to be beaten down by any judicial malignity, I was not so with my clients, and my consequent losses in professional income have never been estimated at less, as you may have often heard, than £30,000. High authority. Curren was once engaged in a legal argument. Behind him stood his colleague, a gentleman whose person was remarkably tall and slender, and who had originally intended to take holy orders. The judge, observing that the case under discussion involved a question of ecclesiastical law, "Then," said Curren, "I can refer your lordship to a high authority behind me, who was intended for the church, though in my opinion he was fitter for the steeple." Use of red tape. Curren, when Master of the Rolls, said to Mr. Grattan, "You would be the greatest man of your age, Grattan, if you would buy a few yards of red tape and tie up your bills and papers." Curren and the Mastiff. Curren used to relate with infinite humour an adventure between him and a mastiff when he was a boy. He had heard somebody say that any person throwing the skirts of his coat over his head, stooping low, holding out his arms, and creeping along backwards, might frighten the fiercest dog and put him to flight. He accordingly made the attempt on a miller's animal in the neighbourhood, who would never let the boys rob the orchard, but found to his sorrow that he had a dog to deal with which did not care what end of a boy went foremost, so that he could get a good bite out of it. "I pursued the instructions," said Curren, "and as I had no eyes save those in front, fancied the mastiff was in full retreat. But I was confoundedly mistaken, for at the very moment I thought myself victorious, the animal attacked my rear, and having got a reasonably good mouthful out of it, was fully prepared to take another before I was rescued. Egad, I thought for a time the beast had devoured my entire centre of gravity, and that I should never go on a steady perpendicular again." "Upon my word," said Sir Jonah Barrington, to whom Curren related the story, "the mastiff may have left you your centre, But he could not have left much gravity behind him among the bystanders. End of Project Gutenberg, James Carson.